we going to start this? Let's just start it. Okay, watch this.
Okay.
So today I've got a few friends with us on the podcast, and it's going to be pretty incredible. So if you're listening to this, you have no idea who I'm talking about, and I'm just building up the anticipation. You know first of all, you know who I am, because I'm always on this. And you might be able to guess the other person who's on this, because she's always on it. There's a clue. Reveal yourself. Guess number one.
I didn't know if we were playing a game. Okay.
Now you guys made it weird. I got to start over.
It's Melissa Gray.
I was like, you're talking as if there's a black screen and they haven't lifted it yet.
Yeah.
Well,
Behind door number 2.
now you probably know the other two.
And the YouTube people,
By the banter, it's Tashara Angel and Eric Eklund as well. I've invited my friends to talk about this topic because in passing or in conversations we've had in the last couple of weeks, they've all said things that I found really interesting and I thought would be a really wonderful conversation to have them in the mix. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's do this thing. So today we're going to kick off, we're going to reflect on the kickoff of our new sermon series, A Courageous Unity, and we're studying through Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, kind of. Did you know that it doesn't say that this is a letter to the church in Ephesus, but this is a church that its earliest copies were found in Ephesus. But this was a kind of letter, an epistle, we call it, that was meant to be distributed to a bunch of churches in and around Ephesus, that region, what we see as modern day Turkey. This was meant to be copied and shared among the churches. So I wonder if Paul could have ever imagined that it would have been copied and shared into Austin, Texas.
Probably not.
Probably not.
Because it didn't exist.
But that is a good point.
That is. Or it did exist. They didn't know.
Short
it was
history
in-
lesson.
So we're already blowing minds.
This place had other names than Austin
did. It was
before.
not
Thank you,
Austin,
Eric. I was going to say something. So we're talking about this letter, and specifically in a time that is pretty chaotic. It feels like there's a crisis every other day. I think we're getting used to the outrage and the crazy and the change, and we're getting used to it, right? It's another way I've heard it talked about. I thought it was pretty funny but true. Is we're getting used to hearing people saying we live in unprecedented times, and we long for precedented times.
Yeah, what happened to those?
So how do you read a letter like this about the unity of the church in the time that we have? So we're going to tackle that today, have a good conversation, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to start off talking about a few terms and clarifying a few concepts before we jump into the text of Ephesians that we heard on Sunday, and then also just get real practical, what to do, what not to do from what it is we're talking about with fighting for courageous unity within the church. So let's jump right into it. We talk about divisiveness, how that you've all heard this term, and I want to just pitch it to you guys. How have you heard the term divisive? This is so divisive, or stop being so divisive, or like we're living in a very divisive time, people might even say. How have you heard that talked about, and what do we mean when we talk about unity in light of divisiveness and division and things like that? Charlie, let me come to you first, and just how have you heard it said? How's that function?
I feel like people like to throw out this is divisive when it's something they don't agree with, or they know it's going to be something they don't agree with immediately. So it's like to kind of squash the conversation. They're like, I don't want to be divisive. You're being divisive, and it's kind of like they're uncomfortable with it, so they're trying to end the conversation.
Oh, so it's like discomfort.
So, yeah,
I think really saying.
I think it feels more like discomfort.
Like I wonder if for some people who are trying to say that, if it might be helpful to hear, you're making me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
As being maybe a little more honest about it.
Right.
Well, and I think a lot of people who talk about it, it's the first time that maybe they felt uncomfortable in church.
Oh, yeah.
Or in spaces in their lives because spaces were created for them.
It's a great point. And I would say, just to revise even what I think you're right. The people aren't used to being uncomfortable in church, and people are also used to blaming other people for how they feel.
Yeah.
So when you say you are making me uncomfortable, it might be better to say I feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Why is this making me uncomfortable?
This topic makes me feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Being aware of those terms, they're really significant because that term divisive can be used to actually bury the division that already exists, or to overlook, or it's really our request to say, can we just ignore this?
Right.
Can't we all just get along? That kind of a sentiment. Now, but what does that work do for people who are being most adversely affected by whatever the difference is or the disagreement is? So, for instance, I heard this analogy given the other day, or I think I read it. I have a terrible memory. I don't know. That said, like if you had 2 kids and you're feeding I have 6. Let's just make it about me. I'm feeding my kids, and I give a bunch of food to all my kids but one kid. And that child says, I'm hungry. I would like some food. And I turn to the child and say, you're being divisive. Stop it. That's how it can be used. When the kid is saying, but I have not been fed. I'm not getting food. What me saying that this kid is being divisive is actually veiling an injustice, an inequality, an unfairness, a wrongness being done, but veiling it with something that is actually kind of gaslighting. Is actually like you're the problem here, not accepting responsibility for the fact that I have actually not served this child food. So there's a lot of potential damage that can be done with even seemingly benign comments like this is divisive. You're being divisive. We got to be really careful about what we mean by that. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk. We'll get into the weeds more about that. But another one, unity and otherness. When we say we're pursuing unity as a church. And I've even brought up in sermons when we other people, and I put that in quotes. What do we mean by that? Eric, how have you been thinking about unity and otherness? What comes to mind?
Well, there's 1,000 different things that come to mind with
Always
unity.
in your mind. There's
Exactly.
1,000 things.
It's really true.
You live there.
Because typically when we other someone at the most basic, we're essentially distinguishing them from ourselves. And so when you other someone, you're essentially saying or enacting this idea that they only have meaning for you in the context of you. So
That sounds pretty narcissistic or like self-centered.
And
at
it
the
is.
least.
That's why you're here.
Yeah, no. So, but that's what happens is when we're talking about the other, and in the academic world, we constantly are talking about the other because it is a hot topic. But we're thinking about what does it mean to be the other, and so it's always something that isn't me. It's a person that's not me. But also, it can turn human subjects into objects. Slavery is one of the things that did it real well, and that's not a good thing. But beyond that, you also have another conception of otherness, multiplicity, difference in theology, where you get this really cool theologian who we have no idea who he is, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite.
What a name.
Great name. We have no idea who he is.
It's a great name for like if you're having a child, and you're looking for names. There's like 6 you just said that could.
Exactly.
Pseudo's a great one.
Dionysius. Everyone needs a definite article in their name. Like the King Charles III.
Tyler the Creator. Megan the Stallion.
There you go.
The Stallion.
It's a trend.
Yeah.
But anyways, so he talks about the Trinity as both one and many. That's basic orthodoxy there. But thinking through Christian unity would be a unity in multiplicity. That
Say more about this.
God didn't create, let's say God didn't create more than one human being, so that way as at the end of time they can merge back into being one thing. God, as C.S. Lewis puts it, who also read Pseudo-Dionysius, he says something to the effect of God prefers the longest chain possible. God doesn't want simplicity so much as a really complicated system that would be able to kind of refract the unity that is God, but in that refraction it gives a stable, unified image.
So an image is actually a great image to use here for like painting without lines, or painting without colors, or painting without depth is very uninteresting, if even possible. And so if we consider that God is in this analogy some sort of artist painting with an infinite amount of, or at least multiple differences and othernesses within the body. God is creating something beautiful that has depth, that has lines, that has character to it, right? That is saying something. But how do we tell the difference between the kind of otherness that smears the image of God in people versus the otherness that we can celebrate and say, oh, there's beauty here. You're different than me. And that's great. Like, thank God you're different than me, right?
So I wasn't planning on C.S. Lewis, but this is where C.S. Lewis is amazing.
Let's go.
Because he read his pseudo Dionysius. So C.S. Lewis, I think it's somewhere in his space trilogy, he speaks.
You and your deep cuts, man.
Yeah.
Golly.
He discusses, he suggests this idea that, and he says this in The Great Divorce too, that everyone has their own unique language with God, and that he interprets the new stone of Revelation when we're going to be given a stone with our new name that only us and God know. Lewis extrapolates from that to make the suggestion that our ultimate purpose in heavenly existence, whatever that looks like, is to communicate that secret language that we have with God to others. So essentially that could look like we would have all of infinity to learn everyone else's private language with God. And because God, for C.S. Lewis, for Pseudo-Dennis, wants this maximization of unity and difference, Lewis makes the suggestion that God wanted this maximalization of those things so that way God could have reflected back to God's self an infinite number of others. That he can see himself in them, they can see God in themselves, and he ends it by saying, lest the glory of the universe should go anywhere go limping. So the idea being, if there's even one person missing from this, if there's one person who has a unique language with God that isn't there, then we're missing something of the revelation of God.
So this is good news for people if they're listening to this and going, but I'm super strange, or I'm weird, or I'm not like
You're a good weird.
Or even people that, but even people that
Gotta
go,
clarify that.
oh, I know church folks, I'm nothing like them, and sort of self-select out. We're doing a disservice to them in not giving people the invitation to not only belong, but that actually communicating the necessity of their belonging. You exist because you are God's idea. And I know the church may not be like you, but it's all the more critical then that you go to the church, that you're part of the church, because actually God created you with your difference in mind being part of that community for like a really good reason. Now, there's some differences that we've just previously talked about that don't have a place in God's community, right? There are certain things that we would say, well, I mean, even in Paul's example, the difference then was being a Gentile, and Paul's in prison because he has fought so prolifically and written prolifically about including the Gentiles. So those who would exclude people, those who would discriminate against or dehumanize, or basically, if I could summarize, take up the tools of the devil against other human beings. That otherness is not some of the otherness of the church we're celebrating. That stuff has no place in the church, actually. Everything else, the otherness of our like different perspectives, our different personalities, our creativity, like there's so many beautiful things about the complexity of human beings. Those things that are made in the image of God, that are God's idea, those have a place in the church. So I think there's a lot more to say there, but there's a distinction worth being made about what we do.
And I think that distinction is, it's not just this kind of, maybe we could say, a shallow celebration of difference, but that is definitely involved. But the negative image of that would be like, it would be the denial of difference. It would be saying we don't need to see those differences, or anyone that draws attention to difference is actually causing the division. And so there's the difference between divisiveness and actually causing divisions versus seeing that, to that hypothetical person that says the church isn't like me, or the church, I'm not like normal church folk. There could be a response from C.S. Lewis that would be, one, maybe the church would be more like you if you were involved.
Sure.
But also, you shouldn't expect the church to be like you at all. No one should be the church would be a mosaic of an infinite number of little tessellated squares. And so ideally the church isn't like any of us. Ideally. But that would mean there's of course going to be space for you, because no one can actually take your space.
Like you. Right. All right, man, we're going deep. All right, reconciliation. Melissa, talk to me about this, because you had brought up this point earlier. What do we mean when we say reconciliation? And where is that in the place? What place does reconciliation have in unity? Like, can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times when people talk about divisiveness or conflict, they want to squelch that because they want to say like, oh, but we have to forgive and forget. And instead, there needs to be, and this is something that I learned a lot about in doing the Be the Bridge curriculum, about reconciliation and how there's forgiveness with action. And so it's not about forgetting or like pretending like something never happened. Reconciliation is actual true forgiveness where there's forgiveness with an action and like naming the thing that's
Making it right.
divisive and making it right.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful, because what we don't want to happen with our call to unity is skipping over the actions that need to make things one, or the things that need to be made right.
yeah. And I think the thing that's really important here is sometimes reconciliation looks like when we're a part of a church, we're a part of a community, it looks like us asking forgiveness for things that have happened that we may not have actually done ourselves. So part of reconciliation, for instance, within Be the Bridge, they talk about as a community praying and or saying liturgies that ask for forgiveness for the way that enslaved people were treated through the years, or how Black people have been treated through the years, or insert another
Gay people have been treated through the years.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily you asking only for forgiveness for like the things that you have physically done. It's as a community asking for forgiveness together.
Yeah. So for instance, like another example that I run into is when I meet women who feel like who have been really diminished in their role in the church, or excluded from leadership or power or access to opportunity and like responding to the gifts that God has given them and the call they may have in their life. And maybe that wasn't the church I was a part of, but I still, as a part of the church, I feel compelled to say, I'm so sorry. It should not have been that way.
Yeah.
And that was wrong. Even though I wasn't the one maybe who did it.
Right.
I am certainly a benefactor of a system that has been built around men.
Yeah.
And if in that way and be complicit in that way, I can offer an apology, sure. But on behalf of the rest of the church, we as Christians, we have work to do to apologize for it. And there's some healthy shame in that, like some sorrow, but there's not this like debilitating shame that's like that is locked up in despair. There's actually some beauty in being able to reconcile and name those things.
For sure.
I mean, we
Some
already
freedom.
do it all the time. Like someone, passes away and say your friend's family, and our first words are, "I'm sorry." Well, why are you sorry? What did you do? We already take on some work of reconciliation. We don't even
That's a great
think about it. And like we're given the ministry of reconciliation. So even it doesn't say like we only have to reconcile the harm that we've caused. It just says, Jesus says the ministry of reconciliation, not Jesus, sorry, Paul, the ministry of reconciliation. So there's no kind of boundaries on that. So even though we might set them ourselves.
That's a great point.
Yeah. And there's something beautiful about coming together as a community and asking for forgiveness on behalf of even people who may not be ready to ask for forgiveness.
So it reminds me of Pope Francis extending an apology to Indigenous people in the Americas for the Catholic schools and the treatment of Indigenous people in Catholic schools and reservations, and even before reservations. Like he didn't do that.
No.
But he's
not even from the United States.
right. Yeah, right. Good point. In fact, he's probably got some Indigenous like roots himself. I don't know that we should probably fact check that, but I mean, he's from Argentina, so of course. But he realizes he's a part of a community that needs to reconcile, do the ministry of reconciliation. It's beautiful. So, all right, next thing, being political. Again, these are terms and phrases that we hear used that we think that we should spend some time clarifying. I briefly talked about this on Sunday in my sermon and it's always sketchy when I go off script, but I felt like I needed to say something, which is sometimes I'll get the feedback, not as much, honestly, not very much anymore, but like I'll get the feedback, hey, that was really political, or you're being too political. And I don't think people say that to mean, I don't know exactly, but there's sometimes a pejorative attached to that, like that's not a good thing. But I think what people are most of the time trying to express is the space in which you're operating, the thing you're talking about isn't so much concerned with the Christian life or matters of faith, but now it feels like you've crossed some threshold into public policy or comments about society that are most of the time are also attached to like a Democratic or Republican platform. So that's what triggers people.
That feels like a very political critique.
How so?
Saying, oh, you were too political. It's like, well, I think bring the charge of saying it's too political is already a political charge.
What about, can I clarify? I'm curious what you say about this. What about the charge or the claim? And again, I don't think this is malicious. I think it's just sort of raising your hand is when people say this. When they say that was political, not maybe too political, but that it was in the first place, or you're being political. Do you realize you're being political? Do you think that is a political statement to make?
I mean, I'm probably refusing to make a nuance here. But it's, if we can say this, a few weeks ago, there was the uproar of, all political violence is bad. And if politics is ultimately concerns the benefit of the polis, the city, the state, whatever we want to call it, all violence takes place within a politics. And so saying all political violence is bad is just, you're saying nothing more than all violence is bad. And so we can talk about the church, the separation of the church and state all we want, but the church, our specific church, every individual church operates within a specific political environment. And so there is nothing that is said that isn't already somehow political. It's just, how blunt do we feel that we are allowed to be, or how blunt do we want our rector, the person giving the sermon, how blunt do we want them to be, or how vague do we want them to be? So that way lines aren't drawn in the sand.
Yeah. Because for some people, like I'm struck by the black church, they like have no problems being what a white church would look at and go, oh, they're being like straight up partisan political. It feels like there's a lot of black church tradition but I also, I understand why. Like, and I get why they would organize. I get why the black church tradition sees the need in the faith community to say, well, hey, let's all walk down to vote right now.
Right.
So whereas that would for other people trigger as like, oh, this is way too partisan. There's some, I don't know quite the right answer, but I do think the comment I made on Sunday was that when we talk about the kingdom of God, and we don't mean it in just a spiritual sense, like as if it doesn't affect real human bodies and societies. The moment we begin to talk about how something ought to be or that something shouldn't be in society, we're being political. That's a political statement, right? It is a political
how the city should be.
And not saying anything is political.
Right.
Yeah.
Too.
And there's a little bit of privilege associated with saying, like, well, let's not be political when there are a lot of political things that are directly, like you just said, affecting people's bodies and their livelihood and their, like immediate needs. So I think that saying, let's not be political in itself, we assume some sort of privilege. So there's a little bit of privilege attached to that.
Right. Like, we're not, so there's another part of this. It's like, the church isn't going to raise funds to donate to a campaign. I'm not going to, from the pulpit, tell you who to go vote for. Like, I think there's plenty of godly wisdom about the line that we cross into in a partisan way, partisan politics way, that is inappropriate and actually sort of exposes the preacher, the church, whatever, to some real problems because we're not infallible. Like we get it
Right.
wrong,
Yeah.
and the thing that we want to be terrified of doing, and to weigh heavily on us, is we want to announce the kingdom in the most faithful way possible in our time, and so that's another part of what presents that tension of like, well, you can struggle in the specifics, but but being vague sometimes is a way of just acknowledging I don't have the wisdom I need here and I don't see the future. I don't know the will of God in its entirety. And so in humility, I'm going to only walk up to the line up to this point. And I think that Tashara's preaching, but other than Tashara, like that's a tough thing for a preacher to figure out. Thankfully, we have a church that rolls with a lot of things and has helped me figure that out over the years in really loving ways. So, but yeah.
If I can add,
Yeah.
I think part of the difficulty when we think about politics and let's not say religion, let's say politics and the Bible, because that makes it easier to have a conversation where we're so far separated from the culture and the political world in which the Bible was written that it's really easy to approach the Bible as if it's an apolitical document.
Right.
That doesn't in any way map on, or that we ignore the fact that we are doing a lot of creative work that we're unaware of when we interpret the Bible for our modern context.
Yeah.
So there is
as if the Bible wasn't happening in political contexts.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
inseparable from them, actually.
Yeah.
And so there was this film in the 60s by this director, influential director, Italian. He was Roman Catholic, devout.
Please say Brother, Sun, Sister Moon, the
No.
life of St. Francis.
He was devout Roman Catholic. He was homosexual, and he was a Marxist. And within Italy in this time, none of those groups got along. So this filmmaker, Pier Paolo Pasolini, a lot of internal conflict because he identified with three groups that all for different reasons would want to see him dead.
Wow.
And he directed a movie called The Gospel According to Matthew. And it is a depiction of the Gospel according to Matthew, the plot. And there are all the lines, the entire script for this film is taken verbatim from the Italian translation of the Gospel according to Matthew. You would be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't be shocked, to realize how easy it is to make the Gospel of Matthew sound really Marxist, really anti-family.
Not surprised by that.
Doesn't surprise me at all.
Because when I used to teach high school, I did an entire class on the Gospel according to Matthew because that's bad attitude Jesus. And one of the questions I had for students at the beginning of the class is, according to this one verse in Matthew, I don't remember which, Jesus came to bring what into the world? Most people are thinking in John. They're going to say Jesus came to bring peace. Not in Matthew. Jesus came to bring a sword. He even says, I did not come to bring peace.
In case you were wondering.
Like, came to, divide. And this is also the same gospel where Jesus says, anyone who isn't willing to, you have to hate your mother, your father above me. I will come to set father-in-law against son-in-law, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law. This is a Jesus in Matthew that doesn't care at all about the nuclear family. Not therefore that Christianity's anti-nuclear family, but that the New Testament actually presents a plethora of contexts that we tend to be unaware of because it's just dropped in front of us. That does mean reading the Bible can be difficult, but it also shows that we need to read it in community. We need to be apparent and intentional about realizing we are in a political context that is foreign from when these biblical texts were written. Be aware of it, slow down, and then reflect, okay, how does this map on to us now?
Right. So, for instance, with the texts in Matthew, what did Jesus mean by I came to bring a sword? What did Jesus mean by unless you hate your mother and your father? Did he really promote religious violence? And did he really despise the nuclear family? We can't actually answer those questions thoughtfully or well unless we do the work you're talking about.
And maybe...
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe in the providential outworking of the development and closing of the Christian canon, maybe it was God's divine intention that we do get 4 different portraits of Christ. Sure. So it's the same thing with let's say Job, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs. You're reading Proverbs and you ask the question, why did this bad thing happen to me? Proverbs is pretty clear. You are an idiot. You read Job, why did this bad thing happen to me? I'm God, shut up.
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes, why did this bad thing happen to me? You're alive. Welcome to the world.
What did you expect?
And so, but we get these three
Yeah.
different, diverse perspectives on why do bad things happen to good people.
Yeah.
And the Bible refuses to settle the answer. We can't know. And that not knowing for me is freeing, because that means I don't get the pleasure and the anti-pleasure of everyone saying, well, oh, God is doing all these bad things to me.
Right.
But I find that freeing just because it's essentially pointing out, yeah, sin, evil, these are things that don't make sense.
That's good.
So I think having this diversity of viewpoints, sorry, Alex, for touching the mic, it gives us room for disagreement. It models within the biblical text itself what it looks like to have differing viewpoints on really important theological questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like, man, not only, I'm not going to say only, but Christianity really struggles with this.
Yeah,
I feel like
we do.
other religions, they are more comfortable with diversity of, opinions, diversity of gods, not going there. But like Christianity always wants to be right.
Yeah.
Like we have to be right. It's like we cannot live unless there's one right answer to this.
And perhaps like Western American Christianity
Yeah,
would be more
that's
precise
the
with that,
point.
because
Yeah.
I think our Eastern brothers and sisters are
Yeah.
way more comfortable with mystery than we
Right.
are.
Yeah.
It's the Puritans in us. It's that like moralistic,
Yeah.
right or
High
wrong.
ground.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a gift though, right? With
Yeah.
Western American Christianity.
true.
With that
We
struggle.
like humility, which is the
Yeah, well,
starting
speaking of
point.
which, so
Good
the
little
last thing,
segue you did there.
the last thing in our terms, this is just the opener, guys. Openness, listening, humility, and being wrong. These are all sort of really full images, full words, concepts that we are going to need if we're talking about unity. So can someone talk to me about, well, let's start with this being wrong. As my friends have said, making friends with being wrong all the time. It's like, make friends with being wrong. In my own life, I have worked on this, and in reflecting my own life, it's kind of freeing to admit, like, actually, I've been wrong a lot about really, really important things in my life. And it wasn't the end of the world then. It still isn't now. And I can make peace with, like, you know what? I'm only human. I'm only Sean, and I'm learning a lot, and I'm wrong, like, all the time. So when I'm sitting in a conversation with my wife or a friend or someone, and I have that, there's that moment in the conversation where you realize you're wrong, and
Yeah.
I feel it in my gut, like my stomach, and then anxiety, or it just makes you mad or makes you defensive. That's the moment to maybe reflect on, like, what that podcast was talking about, making friends with being wrong.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
even laugh about it a little bit. Like, I think I might be wrong here. Even practicing saying that can
Yeah.
be really freeing for people.
Yeah.
So there's being wrong. We could talk about some of the other stuff, but openness, listening, and humility, those kind of go hand in hand too. Melissa, you brought some of these words up when we were putting this together. What do you think that we are meaning? What are we looking for in ourselves and in other people in the church? If we're getting after a courageous unity, how do we do that with, how is openness, listening, and humility involved in that?
I mean, I think it's a willingness. You have to practice being wrong. You're never good at it the first time. So I think it's like a continual practice and breathing and self-talking yourself into being okay with it, which is then draws the line to humility. But I think listening when you're having conversations with people, we talked about this, not forming your next statement, but actually sitting and listening and trying to hear where the other person is coming from in love, and having the best, thinking about that person in the best way possible. Not turning them into a monster, I think, is a big thing that we tend to do. Brene Brown talks about that a lot, how when we turn people that we disagree with into monsters, we actually dehumanize them, which gives them an out. And so when you don't do that, you're you then are able to have conversations and hold people accountable.
So, the space of my life, I'm learning this a lot right now is with my teenagers.
Oh,
So bringing in youth, by the way.
Teenagers will always tell you that you're wrong.
They will. But my kids in particular are really gracious, and they don't even have to say it. They just give me a look. And oftentimes I know I'm wrong before we get into the area of whatever we're talking about. And I think it's, so I'll just say as a parent, it's really hard to be wrong with your kids. It's really hard to apologize. I had to apologize to the tinies the other day because I just lost my temper. I was like, what are you doing? And one of them sounded like they were dying. And, it's just one of those moments. And I find it really, really hard to apologize, to be wrong with my kids. And I think part of that is because I'm supposed to be right for them. I'm so used to being right about this. So it's additionally hard to be wrong when you feel like you're supposed to be right. When you're in a position of power or instruction or leadership or care in someone's life, I find it especially hard. But I also have found that when I can, on my good days, like muster up enough humility to tell my kids, you might be right. Or even to leave open some space to go, here's what I think, because we talk politics in the house all the time now. We talk public policy and stuff, and they know they're going to get an earful when they ask me. I'm like, this is what I think. This is what I'm passionate about. But I'm learning to say also, because I'm looking at them as young adults going, they have their opinions too, Sean. So going, but that's what I think. What do you think? And then so that's when the openness and the listening with my kids, not thinking of a comeback while they're talking, but just really trying to seek some understanding with them. When we do that, it forges like a really beautiful kind of dialogue and relationship. You actually find a courageous unity of sorts, even in the family when parents are able to do that with their teenage. And I think teenagers, they look at adults like us in the same way that we look at folks that are older than us who are like genuinely open and teachable. We go, wow, I want to be like that someday. Those are some of the best people in my life.
They are.
So there's a virtue there.
There is. And I think what you said, like it's kind of reversing that, like, and being wrong. Like, why do I feel like I can't be wrong? Like, what's at stake for us
that's a good question.
when we don't want to be wrong? What's at stake there? Like, what are we afraid of? Are we afraid that we just we're going to not be the smartest person in the room? Are you afraid you're not going to be loved? Like, I think there's something deeper there. And when ultimately we're supposed to find our worth and our value in Christ to begin with, and not in, oh, I was wrong, this person's going to think poorly of me, or I'm going to be embarrassed, but or they're going to think lesser. And it's like, who cares if they think lesser? Your value's in Christ. So what? You're wrong. You're human. God still loves you. Like, you're going to move on and live another day, So I think when we feel that heat in these, conversations and conflict, and it's like, well, what's at stake here for me? Why do I want to hold to this point, even though, like you said, I might already know going in that I'm going to be wrong? Why am I still standing on this? What do I feel like I'm going to lose? And then check that, with what's it going to hurt?
Yep.
You're still going to be loved at the end of the day.
And all the more reason for a community like ours to regularly tell people in their face, hey, I love you. Hey, that was what you just said. That mattered to me.
Yeah.
Or you have hey, good job on that sermon, Tashara. That's a regular diet of communicating trust and love and dignity. You are something, you're important to me. That regularly, it creates this bedrock, this soil of love that is the power of God, the power of the love of Christ. That from upon, on top of that, from which we can actually have hard conversations.
Right.
That context of trust and love. Then we can have the disagreements that we need to have because of those differences. So encourage each other, people.
And I think practically too, just a practical thing. I try to be in rooms where I'm not the smartest person. I know I'm not next to Eric all the time, always, but I don't be afraid to put yourself in rooms where you're not going to be the smartest person, because you're inevitably going to be wrong in those places, and it's good practice. You'll get used to it.
And if you think that that's impossible to find yourself in a room with people smarter than you, before 3, I was in chapter 2, just giving some context. In verse 19, I thought this is really important. It's 19, and also the way Paul works through this and gets to 22. He says this, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God. That's beautiful. No longer strangers and aliens. Speaking of other, right? There's no other anymore. And then verse 22, you are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God. So it's not just unity, but this is the home of God that we're talking about. I think that's pretty amazing. And then in chapter 3, verse 16, Paul goes on with a prayer. He's painting this picture for the church to be one. And when we were asking the letter, like, so what does that look like? Well, Paul's like, well, you're going to need these three things. Here's a prayer I wrote for the church. And he says this, that you would be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit. Verse 17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. What a beautiful phrase. And that we would so deeply know this love. In verse 16, he says that you would be filled with all the fullness of God. That's really beautiful. So these three things, being filled within your inner being, with strengthened in your inner being with the power of the Spirit, so the indwelling of the Spirit, that Christ would dwell in your hearts, the indwelling of Christ, that grounds us and roots us in love, and that we would be so rooted in love that we would be filled with God, the fullness of God. There's something really Trinitarian here to put your finger on, but also it gives what occurs to me here that I didn't really spend time with in the sermon was that Paul's urging us to be one. He's praying for us to have the indwelling of God's life. He's calling us, pointing us to unity with the Trinity. And that is the vehicle through which we find unity with other brothers and sisters in Christ. So this seems like a theological point, and it is, but practically, I think this means that we aren't one in the church because of a lot of things that we may think makes us one. We're one in the church, not even because we like each other. We're one in the church because we are seeking oneness with God. We're seeking a life with God. We literally come to a table to commune with God and find that we are communing with our neighbor as well. So this is to me, this is a political point in the sense of the word, meaning how does this impact human bodies and societies and communities? Because I think this is real. I think that we can say amen to this prayer and cooperate with this work of God drawing us, reconciling us to himself, which is the gospel in Christ. And the after effect, the impact of that is looking around and going, oh, there's a courageous unity in this church because we're in Christ together. So when it comes to then practically issues that pop up in the world or issues that pop up between one another, maybe there's conflict or differences. I want to ask, like, we're practically, how do we then live this out? If this is true theologically, and I'm even saying it's true really, like politically, like in terms of the way we live with one another, how do we practice this and cooperate with this when it gets tough? It's easy when you love people, when they're like your buddies.
Right.
It's not easy when you don't like them or you disagree with them or you're just different in some way. So how do we do this, people? Anybody got any first passes on like how this actually looks in your life and where you find this hard to live out, to practice, especially when it comes to disagreement? Should I throw myself under the bus?
Yeah, absolutely.
First?
For
sure. Okay. Everybody's like,
We're just waiting.
So I have a unique seat in the church. I'm the preacher oftentimes, and so I will say things that people can respond to, and so it often reveals difference. People go, they'll say, "Hey, nice sermon." The most fun comments about a sermon are, "What you said is doing work in my life. I'm working. It's doing something in me." That's amazing. The other super fun thing to hear is, "I disagree with what you said." And I'm not inviting, like, don't come at me, bro. But like, it's often very interesting because I realize either my own blind spot, or lack of hospitality of differing views. Like there's other ways to see this, but also it gives me an opportunity to learn from someone that is seeing things very differently, and even getting to know the things that are behind the thing that we're talking about, the things that are involved. So I learn all the time in I have opportunities to learn all the time in difference. And so for me, especially being a clergy person in a position of power and expressing a difference from a platform that is supposed to communicate the sacred word of God and the news of his kingdom, trying to be cognizant of all that dynamic, right? For me, what it looks like to exist in difference in disagreement with other people is to strive to like lower myself completely, disarm myself completely, and truly try to listen and seek understanding. So, and maybe another way of saying this is suspending judgment and seeking understanding.
Right.
Because number one, I've been like studying this text all week, and I feel like I could be like armed to the teeth about
Yeah. Right.
my point. But actually, it's not really motivated in love. What would be the first step in being motivated in love that I find challenging is the first thing to do is like, hold on, okay, I'm just going to suspend my judgment. Tell me about it. Help me understand. That's a great phrase that I use all the time. Would you help me understand where are you coming from with that? Interesting. Tell me more. Even when it's hard.
Yeah.
Even when it's hard. What? Why is that funny?
No, it's just hard. That's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. Did you just yawn?
Yes,
It was
I'm
like,
sorry.
you're falling asleep and trying to
I'm
hide
not
it.
falling asleep. I'm just yawning.
So, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say, yeah. I mean, it's like I feel like we always talk about that scripture. Everybody wants to use iron sharpens iron.
Right.
Well, it's like, well, what does that look like? Like, there's friction.
Yeah.
Like, there's friction. There's going to be conflict, but that's actually how you learn, which is what you were just saying. Like, you can try to learn something from the friction. Like, why am I feeling this? Why is this hurting? Like, why is this making me uncomfortable? But like, in order for there to be a sharpening, there has to be some friction.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. What's this about is another great question. And not just for other people, but for yourself.
Yeah.
Especially if you find yourself being defensive in the church.
Yeah.
Someone's like, well, I don't think that babies should be baptized or whatever, you know. I'm trying to pick like benign. It's not benign. This is actually a big deal, but things that we can see as like, okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Or, man, you guys make a big deal about Holy Eucharist. I don't think you should be waving smoke around and ringing bells and wearing, costumes and stuff. The most loving thing I think is actually to ask like, what's that about? And then, or if I feel a defensive about it, because I love these things, I love baptizing babies, to before I jump on somebody, ask myself like, Sean, what's that about? Why do you feel like you need to jump on this?
Yeah.
Could you possibly create a loving space, a gentle space for people to share where they're coming from and let themselves be known, and even to let the difference breathe a little bit without having to button it up?
Yeah.
This is what Jesus does with us.
I mean, this is one of those things that I think about, like big theological arguments, baptizing babies and what you think's going on in the supper of the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. Like, I've known people where so much of that conversation that I've had with people that have left churches under good terms, under bad terms, any variety of terms, is also kind of realizing where it's just, let's say, infant baptism or believer's baptism, whichever one you want to pick. You could find enough verses in the Bible to substantiate both.
Sure. Yeah.
So the question now goes into, well, saying the Bible is clearly doesn't work because the Bible is clear for two contradictory positions.
And the same thing. I'm interrupting.
No, go ahead.
Like those examples are kind of cheap because those things we can like kick around ideas and it doesn't really affect people's lives. We think, but like for instance, think of the things that we've gone through as a church when we are. When we've been dealing with like the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and systemic racism and the moments where we would as a community gather and talk about these things or study about these things and learn about these things, or the ordination of women. We haven't that's been settled long time. Women have been ordained and working in our church for a while, since the beginning actually. So that's a little less it has a little less of an impact, but like I think it might be good to give an example of something that we're actually dealing with, or we have that is actually dividing people in our community as a church. So infant baptism isn't really. I don't.
Well,
think.
if I can make the point though, the small point being that with those conversations, sometimes it's just turned into, well, you don't think like an Anglican, and that's okay.
Sure.
And so it's realizing, do you want to stay somewhere where the vast majority of the church and the clergy don't think like you about these things? Or do you want to find someplace where you just naturally fit and you finally can find a church context in which you're not constantly feeling like everyone's against you when you realize you're just in a place that doesn't think like you.
Yeah.
On these minor matters. So we're thinking minor conflicts, just like sometimes you can part in peace.
Yeah. That's right. But
But let's get something difficult.
No, but let me just say this. So, like, our church went through an issue. Alex loves all of your tapping and bumping. He'll get over it.
I've done it twice.
I'm just saying I noticed it. I see
I
you,
definitely
Alex.
did it once. Sorry.
You just did it again.
Listen,
Can he have
I
a
did.
tally?
This podcast is more like it's concerned about Alex.
Can we just do like one
Maybe
big shake of the
to a
table?
unhealthy degree. No. So let's go. Like what we just went through as a church. There was like, I would say yes, there are instances in which people can disagree in a healthy way, and then also depart in peace. But there's also, I would say, so many times when I wish people would stick around, and not only for their own growth, but also like I've been in churches where people leave, and I ask them, have you over, for instance, women's ordination or women's role in the church? And they'll say, well, this is what I've decided. I'm moving on. Not this church. And my question was like, did you talk to any of your sisters in the church about what that does to them with you leaving? Yes, you disagree, but could you hold your disagreement in a way that doesn't like further burden the people who are most affected by this opinion that you have? Like those sorts of like presence and absence actually. They do work in the room. They do work in communities. How do you do that well in a way that doesn't harm people? That actually you can stay and you can leave in ways that love your neighbor. I'm just filing it there. I'm off my soapbox.
No, I mean, I agree. I kind of agree with that. Like, I feel like we have to be really careful about only being in spaces where we feel completely comfortable. Like when I'm in a space where I feel too comfortable, I feel like I'm not growing. Like some things, what am I missing? I'm not learning. And if I'm not pushed to grow, then I'll just sit there and be stagnant. So it's like, I feel like there's a lot of positive in being in places where you are uncomfortable, not necessarily like you're unwanted or like, treated poorly. I'm not saying that at all, but
like we're not talking to people of color who are in a church that doesn't want to deal with racism.
Yes.
We're not talking to women who are told to find their place in the home under their husband's headship and do whatever we're not talking to like this. There's a different conversation about people in places of vulnerability, and the least of these, the weak, the poor, the marginalized. Right. They need to hear a different message. But for most of us, in other ways, like we are not being tread on as much as we would like to communicate that we are. So oftentimes I think people confuse like ideological harassment versus things that actually impact their body, like costs to their body, to their lives. And we think, oh, they disagree with me, they must hate me. No, actually, and you, by the way, if you didn't know that, you can disagree and love people. You don't ever have to hate them. And disagreement doesn't mean that people hate you either. It's just disagreement. All right, soapbox over. Okay. Did you make your point, Eric, or did we just totally...
Oh, no, I made my point.
Okay, good. All right, well, we got a few minutes. I wanted to do a speed round here of some like what not to do's with relating in church community, in Christian community, really any community, what not to do. So number one, I mentioned this in the sermon, but Melissa, I want to hear you talk about this. How to like not check out. Like when things get hard, there's tendencies to avoid the pain of the difference or the disagreement. What should we avoid or watch out for doing? And what would you say is like actually better practices or something that some advice you'd give us about like, well, how not to check out, how not to bury your head or totally act like sweep it under the rug, as we say, that there's not a problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think noticing, you've talked about this in this podcast, noticing how your body is feeling when you have a disagreement. And a lot of times when we have like body reactions, we'll stop it from happening instead of like kind of pushing into it so that we can learn and grow. Because I think we can have a tendency to, when we enter into a disagreement or something makes us uncomfortable, if we totally ignore it and push it away or not confront it, we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to grow and learn something. And we're missing out on relationship with a real, genuine relationship with someone. Being able to have a conversation where you might not agree. Because I I do think when you are in a relationship with people, but you never give yourself an opportunity to disagree, it's not a real, genuine relationship. You're not giving yourself the opportunity to show love and actually live in true unity
and vulnerability, even.
Yeah,
right?
you're cutting off a part of yourself. But both parties are.
Or hiding a part of yourself so that the other person can be happy with you.
Yeah, or feel comfortable.
Feel comfortable with you. It's hard. There's certain relationships that I wouldn't advise being totally vulnerable.
For sure.
especially-
You have to feel safe.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Tashara, what about in conflict? How can we build deeper relationships? Like, how is conflict? First of all, it's not, as Erica said. Say it, Eric. Conflict is amoral.
Oh yeah, conflict is amoral. Like there's good conflict, there's bad conflict. I mean, if
Just
we're
conflict.
yeah, no, it's just I mean, I'd say God has a conflict with the devil, and I wouldn't be like, oh, that's bad. There's a conflict, and God's part of it.
In fact, conflict can be a sign of health in a community.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no,
If you don't see it, like if I'm sitting down with like a couple who wants to get married, they're like, we never fight. I'm like, that's a red flag.
oh yeah. Well,
to fight a little
this is something. Maybe it's religious trauma, but it's a religious trauma I share with my wife, and it's we kind of make this joke. Well, we make this joke of kind of if you're going to church and like the sermon never makes you uncomfortable, then why are you even going? Because if you're not getting challenged, if there's nothing that is actually like pushing against you, then like what are we doing?
Conflict.
Like conflict is kind of a good thing. Violence can be a good thing understood in a broad context of, you need to get heart surgery. That's going to get pretty brutal and bloody.
Oh, I see what you mean.
But that's a beautiful violence. That's a life-saving violence.
Sure.
For sure.
And so understanding in those contexts, it's just conflict can be a very good thing. But are you just going crazy and going ham on people just because you're mad?
Right. That's not
different.
Right. That's different. So tell us, like, how does it build relationships then?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like kind of it goes along with what Melissa was already saying, like vulnerability and in the right context with the right people. Like you have to share what you're really feeling in relationships. Sorry, Alex, I just hit the mic. God,
We kind of stopped.
I'm sorry. Okay. And inevitably, like we're all different people. Like Eric said at the beginning, like God made us differently. Like so we're not all going to think the same. And I know, like for me, I've gotten into some arguments with like some of my best friends, closest friends. One friend in particular went on a trip to Puerto Rico, and Joe, if you're listening to this, sorry. But we got into a huge fight there. Like we'd been friends for like 10 years, got into a huge fight, didn't talk the rest of the trip.
Oh no.
And didn't talk for like months after this fight. And then, eventually we like reconnected after realizing like, okay, wait, this friendship means more to me than this conflict. And like he ends up helping my husband propose to me. So, but it was like through that conflict that we realized like, wait a minute, like you as a person, like this relationship is more important to me, like than the unity in this relationship is more important to me than whatever this conflict was. And I realize that doesn't apply to every conflict. So let me just make that clear. Like some things are like very important, but I think that when you don't like that conflict help deepen the relationship. And so I think when you bump against, things that you don't agree with in somebody else, or they don't agree with you, and you survive it, it deepens the relationship. So,
because that's, I think in the dialogue, the difference, even the conflict of it, you can see where the other person is more clearly in some ways. That's what makes it so uncomfortable.
Right.
But don't miss the hidden blessing here. You get to see them more clearly.
Yes.
Like that's what's deepening.
Right.
And I'll double down on the caveat. And if you're in an abusive relationship, we're not saying that the conflict will deepen your marriage or your relationship at all. You should get a hold of us and get the hell out of that situation. It will help you. Finally, Eric.
Yes.
Can I ask you? I wouldn't even have to ask you. I could just say it into the air and you would catch it.
Oh goodness, what is this?
No, you're gonna like it. So unity is not about just being nice. Or not liking people even, or being liked.
Yeah, no, you can.
You don't care about this at all, do you?
No.
This is why you should care a little bit more, I think. And Sarah would agree.
Oh, of course you would.
You could be
She's a
little
much better
nicer.
person than I am.
She is.
No, but part of it is just, I mean, C.S. Lewis even talks about this in Mere Christianity, that like in his church context, it's like he'd find himself, kneeling next to a guy that he can't even stand. But just like part of the beauty of church is that you're going to, ideally, and admittedly this was in a mid-century English Anglican context where everyone went to church and there were parishes that were all walkable. And Sarah and I want to move back.
Sounds amazing, doesn't it?
But for C.S. Lewis, in that context, he's saying, where else are you going to interact with people that aren't the same color as you, that don't have the same education as you, that don't have the same job as you? And so there's like all these conversations about, people are so disconnected these days. And sometimes people are saying, well, it's because people don't go to church. And I do think at least that's part of it, of where else are you going to meet people that aren't your coworkers and your boss?
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of church.
It puts you right there next to people.
Yeah, people
shoulder
that
to
you
shoulder.
typically never talk to, and sometimes people you still won't talk to.
And there's an element of this that you're saying, and that's okay.
And that's okay.
However, so that's a unity, right? However, the flip side you'd want to clarify too, right? To say, and it doesn't help unity for you to be a jerk or to be not nice or to be like inflammatory or provocative or even to tell someone like, I don't like you. That's not. That doesn't really help build
You're
up
a
the
jerk
unity
at
of the
that
church,
point.
right?
You're definitely in the wrong.
But if those things exist, that's also not the end of the world.
Exactly.
Right.
Like there's an element of, I mean, I never had siblings, but there's an element, like I've heard that siblings, especially when they're young, fight. I've heard that happens. Did they stop being siblings?
Some of them, but no, not technically.
But okay, let's
Not
say
my siblings. We were like WWF, and we still love each other.
yeah, let's say you're less than 10 years old and you have it out. Like, really, you're going to be fine in 72
So
hours.
true.
But my point with all of this is that unity isn't niceness. It's just because you're all nice and you all get along doesn't at all mean that there's any sense of unity. You could go to a Thanksgiving with your family and everyone's nice to each other, and someone might be feeling in that room the only reason it's peaceful or it feels nice is because that person is keeping their mouth shut and they know better.
Yeah, and that
So
stinks.
we're all nice and we get this semblance of unity because this person who has an issue is protecting everyone else
Yeah.
That's
That's a
good.
good point.
from this divisiveness.
Right.
To bring a full circle. And so unity would involve giving people a space to say, there's a conflict here. I haven't had the space to talk about it. So that sense of unity would be able to acknowledge that at the very least that there is a difference and give that difference space to breathe.
Yeah.
Even if it feels really uncomfortable, but just enough to respect you're a person too, you have a voice, you can talk.
That's right. Yeah, and lastly, I would say that, and sort of to sum up our conversation, as we're reaching for unity here, I think maybe I'll say it this way. Maybe this is a little bit provocative, but as long as we strive for unity, we'll never have it. Actually, I think if we strive for Christ, we will.
That's good.
And so what I hope to emphasize with that is we're not in church, like we're not in community with one another just because we're friends or we share certain interests, right? We're in the church because we are in Christ. We pursue communion with God in Christ, thank God, because of the action of God coming to grab us and get us and bring us home. We find ourselves home and we find other people are there too. And that is the unity that the church celebrates. That's the unity the church has been given. And so from that place of oneness that has been made for us, we can extend that to our brothers and sisters. We can stand on that. Like this is the ground we stand on, the love of Christ. And so our starting point isn't disunity. Our starting point is actually we're in Christ. And that's also our reference point constantly for in the midst of our differences and disagreement. We say things like we have been this whole episode, like, well, what would Christ do? What should the Christian do? What does it look like? What we're doing is describing Jesus while standing within the life of Christ, with him within us, within the unity of the household of God. We're describing like, well, how should people act in the household of God who have been given this great unity? So a courageous unity is sort of a byproduct of a bunch of people focusing on Christ and reflecting deeply, discerning deeply, like how would Christ do this? How would he have us do this? And Paul's prayer that we'd be filled with the Spirit and filled with like the fullness of God and the indwelling of Jesus. Like this is what he's getting after, is that communion with God that would result in I think a really beautiful kind of unity that the world would go, wow, that's otherworldly. That's amazing.
Right.
I appreciate you guys taking time to do this. I hope listener and viewer that this has been helpful to you. I feel like we've just cracked open a can of worms here, and there's so much to talk about. And that's great because we have next week. We have more episodes to spend some time. So thanks for spending time with us, and we hope that this has been helpful. God bless you. We'll see you next time.